Hey folks, how's it going? All right, we're going to move into chapter 8. This is the ideology of environmental concern. We're going to start to unpack where our ideas about this issue of environmental concern come from and where that leaves us today. So, when we start to go back to find out who were the first ones that were really talking about the concerns for the environment. Well, as many things tend to start with the Greeks, environmental concerns were certainly present in Greek thought. The origins of the word nature itself come from Latin, natura, which of course is a Roman translation of the word physis. This word physis has a root in Greek phi, meaning simply to be, and phien, to give birth. After about 480 BCE, Greek economics expansion brought wealth, urban growth, and of course, with it, the concerns that are associated with that. Essentially, money and politics, and how those things had become more important than the more simple things in life. This idea of money and politics and material becoming more important in people's lives is a mainstay throughout the development of capitalism and democracy and just the way we've organized ourselves over time. One of the critiques that come out of Greek thoughts is the critique of material desires. This brings us to the sophists. As you read in the book, the sophists are usually the villain when we talk about Greek philosophy, because they really didn't have much of a moral compass when it came to the implications of their arguments. So as you see here, they argued for almost anything goes in reference to morality, but they were concerned with the environment. Plato comes up with the idea of demiurge, or the good. The good was a divine agent of the world. This idea of the good permeates most of Western education, Western philosophy, and this is one of the first places that we see it take shape. Nature, when it comes to the good, nature was, of course, following the good. And much of what we see out of Greek thought is saying that we really need to follow the ways of nature. And nature is a embodiment of the universal order, a God, a purpose. Nature was cured of materialist desire and could become a source of moral guidance in a world of envy and greed. So as capitalism, or not capitalism, but as money and politics start to take shape and take hold, one place that we could find solace and find some quote-unquote goodness was in nature. And hopefully what we would develop is a discovery of a natural conscience. We also find this type of thought in the Chinese and Indian cultures. The Taoists really embody this protection of nature perspective. They took a skeptical view of the human world, and once again, very critical of self-centered money interests overtaking ancient Chinese society and how those moneyed interests in urban areas tended to really draw us away from the simple things in life. Uh, the Taoists offered an alternative way to self interest, i.e., the way or the Tao. And this is the principle that underlies what we in the West would call natural, the natural order of things. Whenever I think of the Tao, I think of a stone flowing down a river. It might be in movement until it's not. When it's in movement, it is doing what it's supposed to do, and when it's stationary and not moving, it's doing what it's supposed to do as well. It's just simply going with the flow of nature. The Tao is unaffected by human beings, and people do best when they allow themselves to be guided by the Tao and not by human desire. Human desire ultimately takes us away from the natural way of things. We also find this type of thinking in ancient Rome, as you can imagine. We started this conversation with a conversation about natura and how that's a Roman translation of phi or physics in Greek. The poet Horace essentially praises naturalness of rural living and praises its social consequences. His argument is that what's happening in urban areas is a movement away from the natural way, and what's going on in rural life is much more rooted in this natural consciousness. And he argues that nature will always push back. This pushback was in response to how Rome was really modernizing at that time. We don't think about the technological advances that the Romans made because it seems like such a long time ago, but the Romans had flushable toilets, they had showers, baths, they had spacious apartments, they had a well-developed culture of money, a well-developed culture of power, and a well-developed culture of politics, and we find an overwhelming presence of greed in this society. So all of these things are something that is being pushed back by writers and theorists like Horace in ancient Rome. Nature in Rome, how it was constructed, well, there was a concern for nature and how it can't be separated from the concern about social interests and how those shape our moral understandings. So to experience nature is to experience social innocence. Horace felt like the rural life embodied that social innocence, that natural innocence. And the only way to get back to it was through a discovery of a natural conscience. But just because you've developed a natural conscience, it doesn't mean that you've escaped the moral problem of interest. And Horace is a good example of this. The home that Horace lived in his rural landscape was very much defined by his own self-interest, even though he wasn't embracing the unbridled self-interest that we find in the cities at that time. That brings us to the moral basis of a contemporary environmental concern itself. What is the moral basis? Well, historically, nature often linked with other concepts like religion, science, race, and gender. And it was often criticized for human interests motivating these sources of moral judgment. And it brings us to this basic set of moral ideas that are rooted in nature and are socially byproducts of power within social organizations. Um, there's some critiques of uh, this environmental perspective, one being postmodernism, that argues cultural trends that emphasize scrutiny of various visions of this natural conscience exist, and we don't really have any way to determine which one is the best, and that really creates a moral dilemma. In other words, if all that motivates us is power and self-interest, is there any truly moral place to stand? And is one person's stance any more morally justifiable than another person's stance? This is one of the problems of postmodernism, is that we can slip into just absolute relativism, and we want to make sure that we're able to come at some understandings of the world, and come to some agreements on those understandings that aren't simply based on, I believe this and you're wrong. Thoreau, as we're moving into we're still in the classics, but we're getting closer to modern times. Thoreau is another voice for this development of a natural conscience. His concern was for the direction and motivation behind and the environmental transformations as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So Thoreau is watching the Industrial Revolution unfold, and he's really concerned about what's going to happen to the environment itself. And so Thoreau comes up with a simple resolution, and that is return to a pure vision of nature and escape back into the rural, and to reconstruct nature as the wild, the woods and the winds and the farms. That was where humans could go and become more natural. For Thoreau, in the wild was you found no society in the wild. Therefore, you didn't find anything to conflict with. He used a term called the natural other, or a vision of interest-free of an interest-free realm upon which to base a natural conscience. So if you want to develop a natural conscience, you're not going to do that in an urban landscape. You really need to escape out into the wild. And Thoreau was also, in some respects, anti-knowledge. He praised ignorance and recognition of how little we knew. And I think that many of us find some of what Thoreau was getting at in the precautionary principle, and that is how, if we don't understand the impacts of what can happen based on our decisions, and we don't make decisions on whether we can implement some of our solutions that might cause harm, then knowledge really is not doing us any good, and ignorance might be a better solution for us.